What Edward and Gilbert Clare did do was they suspended the rules of chivalry. They march close to Evesham, but they halt at a place called Mosham, which is a couple of miles away, where they come up with their battle plan. And one of the things they do is they tell their followers, don't spare anyone, forget all that. For this day only,
For all
we're
that
not.
wokery.
Yeah, forget all that wokery. We're not doing it. This is proper old school. Remember the Vikings.
Hello. On the 4th of August 1265, Henry III's army, led by his son Edward, met Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, and his rebels at Evesham. Henry himself had earlier been captured by Simon, and so perhaps that motivated Edward and his followers to exact a terrible revenge. In a brutal battle, the majority of Montfortians were wiped out. Edward was victorious, and so Simon de Montfort's rebellion was over. Or was it? His relatives continued their campaign against Henry, meaning this particular civil war was a long-running one. And was that necessary? Joining today is David Pilling, author of Rebellion Against Henry III, as he joins to discuss Henry III, his son Edward, Simon de Montfort, and this particularly brutal English civil war. Plenty more history on the way, so please do share with friends and family, but until then it's me talking medieval civil war with David Pilling. David, great pleasure to have you back on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And so for the listener's sake, I mean, David, you've written many, many books, both fiction and non-fiction.
Yeah.
And today we're going to base our chat around, this is the reign of Henry III. And this is based, very early on when starting this venture up, David, I read one of your books, which is what we're talking about today, Rebellion Against Henry III,
Yeah.
the Disinherited Montfortians. And I absolutely loved it. It's a period of history I'm not very clear on, but thanks to you now, I'm a lot more clear.
Okay.
And the way you wrote it, you write narrative history very well. So
Thank you.
it made it easy to understand and get into. But for the benefit of the listeners, we're really going to be talking about Henry III and in particular the sort of civil war that raged, particularly the sort of rather juicy bits, I guess starting around 1265. But before that, it'd be great to just get a bit of an understanding of Henry III and the early years of this. I mean, I'm going to call it a civil war. It's a Montfortian civil war. How should we describe
Yeah.
this?
I think calling it a civil war is perfectly sort of justified. I mean, terms like the Montfortian Civil War sometimes get bandied about, which is I think it's a bit clunky. And certainly at its height, you are talking about a civil war. You've got a lot of men who are opposed to the king, who aren't necessarily supporters of Simon de Montfort. I mean, the war carried on for several years after he was killed, and they've got their own sort of local leaders. It gets very, very messy, and yeah, I think it's a full-blown civil war, really. I suppose if you called it that, then people will get confused with the sort of the later civil wars, Charles the and Oliver
We've
Cromwell.
had loads of civil
Yeah,
wars
well,
in.
we have had quite a few because there's another one back in the reign of King John, and they used to be called the Barons' Wars. And you used to have Barons' War One under King John, and then the Second Barons' War under Henry III. And then there was a recent argument that they should be renamed the Bishops' Wars because there were lots of bishops involved. And so I think that perhaps there is a problem with
Yeah,
terminology.
after Henry the First dies, there's a bit
Oh
of
yeah,
a.
of course. There's Stephen and Matilda. Yeah, I mean, that's a very much a civil war. Maybe we should just number them.
Yeah,
One, two, three, four.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, right. So let's talk a little bit about Henry III because he's really the main man.
Hmm.
And I was talking to you before we started recording, and that he's got he's a, a great figure, really, has a legacy, but his reign, if I guess in all honesty, is it's a bit up and down, and
Yeah.
it's a very long reign.
Yes.
But by the years, by around the sort of early 1260s, late 12, when the Civil War starts in 59, and then when it really starts proper in 65, what kind of position is Henry III in? Because I had always thought he'd solidified his reign after getting rid of William Marshall, his kind of regent.
Well, Marshall died um, after only a couple
Didn't
of
get rid of him
years.
then, right?
No, but he did get rid of the other regent, Hubert de Burgh. Marshall dies in 1219 when Henry's still young, but de Burgh hangs on for another 14, 15 years after that. And it's very much a case of Henry reaches maturity, decides he's had enough of being this guy's kind of puppet and forces him out. And then his period of personal rule really starts from about 1230. And to be fair to Henry, he does have a sort of purple patch in the middle of this very long reign where he's very much in charge and he does have some successes. He's not the sort of complete kind of bumbling mediocrity that he's sort of traditionally made out to be. Um, but as time goes on and you get into the 1250s, these sort of cracks start to appear. There are a lot of problems with his administration, and there's this kind of perfect storm that starts brewing around about the mid 1250s. There's a lot of things that happen in a compressed time period. He tries to conquer North Wales, which initially succeeds in this very messy, bloody fashion, but it all starts to unravel in about 1256. He leads an absolute dud of a campaign in 1257 to try and recover his position, and that's a failure. It's a bit of a sort of humiliation. At the same time, he gets involved in this scheme to place his younger son, Edmund, on the throne of Sicily, of all places, which is extremely ambitious. But apart from being unlikely in itself, Henry demands a tax of £90,000 from his barons to pay the Pope to make this happen. And Henry has already taxed his barons and his subjects to the hilt for various reasons. And they're, outraged when he starts demanding another heavy tax, especially, for this Sicilian venture, which everyone thinks is completely mad. Then on top of that, you've got his indulgence of his very unpopular foreign relatives, the Lusignans and the Poitevins. They were many of them were the relatives of his wife, Eleanor of Provence. And what happens is, as soon as he marries her, they start flocking over to England, hoping to, take advantage. And he gives them jobs. He there's lots of them, and he gives them all kinds of plum sort of jobs and titles in England, which again puts, the English barons, the clergy, their noses out of joint because suddenly they're being swarmed by all these foreigners. And then there's Henry's sort of government itself. Parliament won't give him any tax, so he starts demanding money from his local officers, his sheriffs and justices. And in order to get that money, they start trying to extract it from the people in their jurisdictions. And this happens in England and Wales. And what all of this amounts to is that Henry is becoming very unpopular at every level of society. He's annoying everyone. He doesn't, for a man who is now in his, how old is he by this point? He's getting on to 50. He's been king um, for 40 years, 30, 40 years. It's quite surprising that he doesn't seem to learn anything. And he just makes the same mistakes over and over. And he inherits some of his sort of father's, King John's, negative qualities. Henry's very stubborn. And then he engages in this sort of personal battle with his brother-in-law, Simon de Montfort. And that really spirals. And you get this not very fast sort of escalation into civil war. It's kind of very sporadic, and nobody really wants to, everybody knows what a civil war looks like. They all remember what happened in the days of King John. But over a course of 3 or 4 years, it just spirals out of control. Potted summary, anyway.
Okay.
Mm.
So you mentioned Simon de Montfort, of course,
Mm.
and this is, well, the subtitle of your book is The Disinherited Montfortians. Simon de Montfort is, as you say, his brother-in-law, but why does he become so prominent, and what are his motivations?
Well, I mean, Simon's motives are kind of debatable, really. I mean, he used to be perceived as a man who was very much concerned with reform in England. That he just had this kind of this interest in justice, and that he saw that Henry's government was tyrannical and oppressive, and he just wanted to basically make things right. And this gave him this sort of great historical reputation as a lawmaker and a reformer. Um, I'm not so convinced, and sort of more recent historians aren't, because like every medieval baron, Simon was, had this hefty degree of self-interest. Um, One of the things he does is he deliberately sabotages this very important treaty with the King of France in 1259, the Treaty of Paris, which was supposed to bring about a permanent peace between England and France after decades of on-off warfare. Um, Now, Simon had a genuine interest in the welfare of England and, peace and reform, then he would have gone along with it. But what he actually did was he refused to put his seal to it until Henry had paid him back some money that had been outstanding for several years. Um, Now, while it's perfectly true that Henry did owe him money, Simon obviously wasn't concerned with the greater good here. He was using basically this very important peace treaty as leverage to get his money, and he didn't really care if the two kingdoms went to war again and lots of people died. Um, and then there's his sort of personal fanaticism. He wears a hair shirt under his clothes. He's extremely anti-Semitic, even by the standards of the day, which is saying something. Um, and throughout his career, there's this sort of very obvious self-interest where he's using the conflict in England and the disturbances to grab land for himself, which is what everyone else does. But nobody else gets held up as a kind of model of democracy and reform. Um, so yeah, I think he's an ambivalent figure, Simon. I think there's at best there's this sort of mixture of self-interest and maybe a desire to sort of reform Henry's corrupted administration, but they're kind of you know half and half.
Yeah, because of course he's got a great reputation. There's universities named after him,
Yes, yeah, yeah, and I
and
think there's a great big plaque to him in is it the White House? He's sort of one of these figures of in profile. He's one of these figures of the founders of democracy. I mean, he does hold this parliament in 1265 that is very important because he summons two representatives from each borough and each town in England, which basically means he was summoning commoners, albeit wealthy commoners, to Parliament. But it's incorrect to say that's the first time that happened because Henry III's wife, Eleanor of Provence, had done the same thing a few years earlier. Um, and you can also call into question, well, why did Simon do that? And it wasn't because he had some disinterested desire to see commoners given a voice in government. It's because the nobles were turning away from him by that point. They were abandoning him and he needed political support. So he appeals to the commons. But then you could also argue it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what his motives are. What matters is the result. It's a bit like Magna Carta. People say, well, that was originally drawn up by some selfish barons to guard their rights. It's like, yeah, but it doesn't matter because it actually does say in the document you can't knock peasants about, you can't throw people into prison for no reason, you've got to have a due process. And whatever the motives, what matters is how this thing actually works in subsequent generations. So, as I say, I'm kind of 50-50 on Simon. I think yeah, he should be credited with doing some good things, but don't misunderstand the nature of the beast, and who he actually was.
they were both a kind of similar age, really, aren't they?
Henry and Simon.
Hmm.
Let me see. Simon was in his
So I
50s when
put you
he.
on the spot there. I
No, it's
think
all right. I think Simon's about 56 when he dies at Evesham, which is 1265. Henry dies in 1272. He's about 64. So roughly, yeah, yeah, roughly the same age. I think Simon's a bit older.
yeah. And so I guess the sort of the rebellion, I guess, starts around 59, 58,
Hmm.
58. But really, when does it sort of start for proper?
Well, I argue in my book that you get serious outbreaks of violence from about 1260. They started from memory in Yorkshire, where a man named Sir John de Ivell, which is a great name, Sir John Devil, he starts.
And there are a lot of you write this in your book actually. There are a lot of names that get a bit repetitive.
Oh God, yeah, everyone's John, Edmund, Henry. Henry's so many Henrys. But yeah, Sir John Dyville and his followers, they start attacking the Sheriff of York, who is Henry's man. He's one of the Percys of Northumberland. Um, and while this is sort of localized, it's confined to Yorkshire, quite soon afterwards, you get similar incidents dotted all over England. I mean, you're not in a state of outright civil war yet, because at the top level, there's still these sort of diplomatic wrangling going on. I mean, Henry appeals to the King of France, Louis, to get involved, and Henry and Simon go and put their kind of like their counter arguments in front of Louis and ask him to judge them. And surprise, surprise, he comes down on Henry's side because they're both kings. And, the King of France is not going to agree to anything that limits the power of a king because it could happen to him. And Simon's not happy with that. And then, as I say, it spirals from there, and you get this slow sort of escalation into civil war. And you get to 1260, late 1263, and then into the spring of 1264. By that point, you're talking about full blown, like you have got, the king and his barons, Simon and his barons on one side, and you have got what is, to all intents and purposes, a civil war.
At this stage, Henry is, as we've just mentioned, he's getting on a bit. He's
Mm.
not sort of participating in fighting too much, is he? I mean, he's present on battlefields, isn't he? But he doesn't really
I
get
think
stuck in, like unlike his brother, his son.
Henry surprisingly does the Battle of Lewes, where he's
Oh,
captured. He is beaten up quite badly. He has two horses killed under him, and he's knocked about by swords and maces. I don't think anyone's trying to kill him, because the idea is it's like chess. The idea is you catch the king, you take him prisoner. You don't actually want to kill him. But he's in the thick of it there, and
and that battle is key as the Civil War develops into a more serious.
well, the Battle of Lewes is definitely. I think that's a turning point, because there was a battle before it, the Battle of Northampton, but the Battle of Northampton was fought according to sort of standard Queensberry rules, the laws of chivalry. Not many people are killed, or at least not many knights anyway. I think one old knight was killed, but lots of prisoners taken. But there's not much in the way of bloodshed. Battle of Lewes, where it starts to get nasty. In terms of Henry fighting, yeah, he gets involved at Lewes, and then a bit later on in Lincolnshire, because there's this revolts all over the place, and he goes in person to deal with another revolt at the Isle of Ely in Lincolnshire, and he seems to have this rush of blood to the head, where he just loses his temper and gets stuck into this fight with some rebels near a swamp, which he doesn't need to do. Nobody's expecting Henry. He's 58 by this point to get involved, but he does, and he's sort of swinging his sword. I think he's just lost it by that point. And I sort of, you can imagine his knights dragging him away, going, "It's not worth it, Your Majesty. Leave it." But he does get involved on occasion, to be fair. He's not got a reputation as being like a sort of warlike king, unlike, someone like Edward the First. But he didn't just sort of hide at the back.
And these battles, I mean, Lewis is, and as you say, the kind of rules of chivalry. What you would traditionally do is what take barons prisoner and
Mm.
then charge a ransom to release them. That
Yeah, what happens at Northampton is the town is held by Simon de Montfort's son, Simon Jr. Um, and Henry and his army, they storm the town. Um, and Simon himself, Simon Jr., is captured and he's actually dragged out and thrown at Edward's feet. But he's spared. He's sort of picked up and dusted down, and most of his knights are taken prisoner. And then there's afterwards, there's these wonderful transactions where people are discussing how much they're going to pay, like who's going to have a ransom, how much are you going to pay for your ransom? Because it all depended who you were, where you were on the social scale. A knight was worth a lot less than a baron, but it's all relatively civilized. I mean, there'd been a certain amount of violence, but all the knights were covered in armor, and it wasn't particularly nasty. As I said, one elderly knight gets killed, and it's only because he refused to surrender. And eventually they sort of lost patience and just sort of knocked him on the head. But everyone else surrenders because it's understood that we'll be okay. We can just buy our way out of this because this is how chivalric warfare works. And to be fair, there's not much evidence that there's a slaughter of the common soldiers either. They're kind of just turned loose. It's like get lost. Um, so the Battle of Northampton's an interesting one because it's virtually bloodless. It's very much, as I say, Queensberry rules. But then you get Lewis, where things get a bit nastier, and then you get Evesham, which is very, very nasty, and where the normal sort of rules are suspended.
So what causes the change between Northampton? I guess it's a steady grading up
Mm,
of increasing. I get more the stakes get higher, but what is it about
mm.
that goes from Northampton to Lewis that causes this? Is it there are a lot of losses in? I think the Crown, the Army of the Crown, they lose thousands, don't they?
But where, sorry, Lewis or Evesham?
Lewis.
They lose a lot of infantry. And I mean, the losses among the barons are still relatively light, but it's worse than Northampton. A number of men are killed. Some of the Marcher barons suffered losses. One of them, Fulk Fitzwarren, was drowned. The king himself was taken prisoner, and then several of his knights were very badly wounded, could easily have died. One of them, the justiciar, Philip Bassett, he's actually wounded 57 times. It's like, how did he not bleed to death? Um, and what happens at Lewis is it's obviously a defeat for Henry. He and Edward are captured. Um, and it's a humiliation for the king and for the royal family, but also for their supporters, because Simon's army was much smaller, and by rights he should have lost. And it's really Edward who makes a mess of it and should have won the battle, but he doesn't. Um, and in the aftermath, Henry's supporters they suffer. They're kind of pushed out of power. Simon doesn't treat them particularly well, and there's just kind of the atmosphere, the political atmosphere curdles. It sours. You're into this weird situation where Henry is still the king, but he's Simon's prisoner, and he's being dragged about and forced to put his seal to all of these orders that Simon is issuing because there's not a constitution, but the system works in that the king gives the orders. He's the head of state. As long as he's alive, he's got to be seen to be the one who's giving the orders. In fact, but of course, it's Simon who's really doing it, but he can't. So he's got to get Henry to do it. So you get all this very strange period where all of these orders are issuing from the chancery, in which Simon's enemies, including Edward, are being described as traitors and oath breakers and terrible people, and the king wants to capture and kill them, which sounds like Henry wants to kill his own son, but it's actually Simon making Henry do this. He is just Simon's mouthpiece at this point. And I think that is seen as shocking as much as anything else, that the king should be used in such a way. And it's one of the reasons why nobles start to fall away from Simon. They start having grave doubts about what he's really up to.
And then, of course, Edward escapes, doesn't he?
Yes, yes, he does. He escapes from Hereford with the help of his friends, Thomas de Clare, his brother Gilbert. They are the most powerful of the Marcher barons. on the Welsh March.
Oh,
And
now
one,
that's your part of the world, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, it is, yeah. And one of the things Simon fails to do is to keep the marchers on his side. People like the Clares, Roger Mortimer, the Boons, um, all of these people who aren't happy for a number of reasons. One of them being that Simon had allied with the Prince of Wales, Llywelyn, who was an enemy of the Marchers. That they don't want to be Simon's friend, and they formed the bulk of the army at Evesham that wipes him out.
I mean, the Battle of Evesham is really quite nasty, very well
Mm,
described by you. This is where, well, Edward is the leader of I guess Henry's forces, even though Henry remains a prisoner of
mm.
war until this battle. But Edward comes across in your book as a, I mean, he seems to absolutely love fighting.
Yeah, Edward is a violent, very much loves, a bit of the old ultra violence. He's from his sort of teenage 16, 17 onwards, he's almost begging to get involved in tournaments. And I think apart from his own sort of natural tendencies, I think that's a reaction to how his father is perceived. Because Henry is never, although he fights a few wars, he's never really perceived as a war leader. He's a sort of pious, peace-loving king who's a bit inept when it comes to sort of military stuff. And I think Edward finds that humiliating. And he witnesses his father's sort of, disasters and embarrassments. And I think he wants to present himself more like his great uncle, Richard the Lionheart. He wants to live up to that tradition and be a sort of war leader. And yeah, he absolutely he seems to have been addicted to violence. I mean, eventually the Pope had to tell him to stop fighting in tournaments because it was dangerous, and he was the heir to the throne. And you have to sort of think about your personal safety. And it's really a miracle that he kind of he survived his youth really because he's badly injured on several occasions.
And is it his the fact that his father had been captured and treated this way that basically meant that at Evesham the gloves were off, and so because Simon, I'm kind of dancing around it here, but Simon de Montfort is killed in the battle and treated in a pretty
Mm.
unsavory fashion once dead.
Yeah, there is some kind of uncertainty as to who is actually responsible because, and I've sort of done a bit more research since writing this book, and there's some kind of interesting remarks in contemporary chronicles which suggest that Edward might not actually have been in complete control of what happened at Evesham. One French chronicle, which was written up at the time, actually says that he wanted to spare Simon because he was his godfather, but he was overruled by Gilbert de Clare and Roger Mortimer, who had a more kind of arguably vested interest in seeing like Simon was killed. And several other chroniclers, they credit Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, with actually leading the army. Um, so it's kind of uncertain as to what Edward's attitude actually is. I think there's a lot of hindsight because when you look at Edward's subsequent career, he conquers Wales, he hammers the Scots. It's perceived that he's always this hard driving warlord and he just slaughters his enemies. I don't think it's as straightforward as that. Um, Certainly before he becomes king, there's these other very powerful personalities around him. Um, and it may well be that he didn't actually want to kill Simon. But there was the question of, well, what do you do with him? Because um, no earl had been executed in England. Simon is the Earl of Leicester since 1076, hundreds of years ago. You can't hardly keep him in prison forever. It's sort of ridiculous. Equally, though, he's guilty of treason. He's used the king in the most sort of appalling, unlawful manner. So really, it's best to just kill him. Whether it
And
was necessary to mutilate him and all the terrible things that's done to him on the battlefield, that seems to have been done though by the men who actually kill him. There's a man named, I think his name is William Maltravers, who is not one of these very important. He's just a knight, but Simon had taken away his manor and given it to someone else. And William seems to have fought his way through to Simon in this absolutely hellish battlefield at Evesham with all the rain and the lightning. And he's the man who actually hacks off Simon's limbs and possibly does the dreadful thing with his testicles.
Put
Just
in the mouth, aren't they?
yeah, they're initially, and then hung either side of his nose.
Charming.
I suspect it's a lot messier, especially when you get to real violence. What's happening on the battlefield when it's utter chaos, and you've got a lot of men who are driven by vengeance and personal sort of grievance, and it all coalesced around Simon. He's seen as the sort of the man who this guy tried to ruin us. You've got accounts of men shouting, "You old traitor, you're not going to live another moment." And how much control would any leader have in that situation? You know.
And and even by the standards of the day, though, this was a particularly gruesome and brutal battle.
Yeah, it was. What Edward and Gilbert Clare did do was they suspended the rules of chivalry. They stop. They march close to Evesham, but they halt at a place called Mosham, which is a couple of miles away, where they come up with their battle plan. And one of the things they do is they tell their followers, "Don't spare anyone. Forget all that. For this day only,
For all
we're
that
not."
wokery.
Yeah, forget all that wokery. We're not doing it. This is proper old school. Remember the Vikings. This is what we're going to do. And then they pick out 12 of their best, like their biggest guys, and they put together this death squad led by Roger Mortimer, and he's given orders, get through to Simon. Just make sure you knock him out. Now, whether it's Claire or Edward who does this, we're not sure. Um, and the actual death of Simon on the battlefield, it strikes me as a bit like JFK. Who got to him first? Because some accounts say Mortimer ran him through with a lance, but then you have this Maltravers character hacking off his limbs. I think it was a bit like Richard III. You've got this absolute scrum of men all shoving each other to get at Simon and just kill him and just tear him to pieces, which is obviously tragic. It should never have come to that. If you dislike Simon or are ambivalent about him, that's no way to die. And it shouldn't have come to that. It's that there was no need for it really.
Yeah, they could have gone down the old traditional route of hostage taking, and
Yeah,
is that what you mean?
yeah. I just think that it all springs from this kind of personal rivalry between Simon and Henry. And for a long time, Simon was this very prominent figure at the English court. Um, and you have to wonder, how does this man go from he arrives in England as a sort of penniless like French nobleman, and then he catches Henry's eye. He's obviously very competent, given all sorts of useful jobs to do. He's seneschal of Gascony at one point, and he's given the title Earl of Leicester. He marries the king's sister. This is a guy who's obviously climbing his way up the ladder, and then he ends up being butchered on the battlefield in the middle of a thunderstorm. Um, and you just think, well, how did you manage that? Um, and to be killed and then mutilated in such a way which was totally unconventional and arguably kind of triggers this new political violence in England, because from this time onward really things do start to get nastier and nastier when it comes to sort of political executions and how kings dispose of their enemies.
But after this, so one would imagine that with the loss of the figurehead,
Hmm.
that's kind of it for the Montfortians. But that's not the case at all, is it? They carry on the
Yeah,
fight.
yeah. Yeah, that's right. And that's kind of really why I wrote my book, because it focuses on the period after Evesham. Um, and it does get passed over a little bit. Evesham, understandably, is sometimes seen as the full stop. This is where the war ended and the rebels all got wiped out. But they didn't. There were still lots of disgruntled barons and knights in England. It should have been the end of it, and it was meant to be. They didn't sort of go to these lengths for no reason. The idea was to wipe out Simon and his sort of lieutenants, his friends, and that would put an end to it. But Henry, in his wisdom, having survived this very sort of narrow scrape, he and his advisors decide the best thing they can do to sort of, bring about peace and heal the scars of civil war is to disinherit every surviving Montfortian, as well as a lot of men who had never supported him in the first place. Um, Now, to be fair to Henry, and Edward too, because he goes along with it to start with, they were under a lot of pressure from their followers who wanted to be rewarded because they'd stuck by the king throughout this sort of very difficult period. So what can you do? What are you going to reward them with? Well, the obvious thing is to give them land that's been taken from traitors. But even so, it's not much of a defense because it's done on such a massive scale. From about September 1265 onwards, this order goes out, disinherit all the sort of the traitors in England. And you're talking about dispossessing thousands of men. I mean, what is that going to result in? They're not going to stand for it, obviously. You're just guaranteeing another round of civil war, and it's exactly what happens. Even though Simon's dead, they find new leaders who arguably aren't as sort of charismatic. Um, but they're dangerous enough. And England is already in a terrible state because you've had this civil war, and civil wars are always particularly savage. And it starts up all over again, which is great.
But this is was it a kind of was Henry motivated and Edward in doing this is sort of revenge for the rebellion? That's why they decided to punish the Montfortians.
I think there's a mixture of one is necessity because, as I said, they had followers who wanted to be rewarded.
Yeah.
Second is, yeah, I think there was a desire for revenge. I mean, Henry was particularly keen to avenge himself on the Londoners because they had supported the sort of the wealthy citizens of London. They had thrown their weight behind Simon, and London is the capital, obviously, and Henry would expect, the people of London to support him. He's the king, but they didn't. And then there's an element of greed. Um, I mean, Henry and his followers, and very much Edward as well, at least to start off with, when you look at the fine detail of this sort of dispossession, what's happening, they're grabbing lands and rents and monies, all these sort of local districts, just because they can, and it's there and it's up for grabs. And with everyone in this period, everyone who's part of the kind of like the ruling elite, the political class, they are all, without exception, they're all greedy. Whatever their other motives might be, and people can be driven by several motives. They all have this sort of avaricious, show them some land or money that's there for the taking, and their sort of instinctive reaction is to take it and to hell with the consequences. And maybe it's because they're all ultimately descended from Normans. They've got this kind of like Viking blood, and they're all essentially thieves. But this happens on a massive scale, and one of the things I did when I wrote the book is I looked through these sort of inquiries that were set up afterwards to determine who had actually taken what.
Where are these documents based? Are they the National Archives?
A lot of them are in print, which is convenient. The originals are held at the National Archives. The main one that I used is something called the Calendar of Inquisitions, which documents kind of government or local inquiries into any sort of corruption or malpractice that went on. And as say, the originals are held at National Archives, but only half of them survive for the Midlands and the southern counties of England. The ones for what was happening in the north have not survived. But even so, you've still got a wealth of information. And it really is staggering because it goes on and on and on, page after page of, who stole what, who took what. And it's all very sort of gritty and very much on a kind of local level. It's like you've got individual villages that were seized, or the inhabitants forced to pay protection money to this or that lord. And then you've got a lot of knights, local knights, barons who pick the wrong side or just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they're kicked out and replaced with, somebody who'd supported the king. And it's very, I used to read a bit about the English Civil War in the mid-17th century. It's all kind of very similar. You've got this sort of political class that's split down the middle, and they're all feeding off each other. And whatever might be said in defense of Henry, I think this is the wrong policy. This is not going to work. The only way you could make this work is if you kill all these people, which is going to, that involves wiping out half the political class. It's not going to happen. And all you're doing is guaranteeing more violence, more civil war, which is what he gets.
Yeah, I mean the rebels, although they're obviously on the run, aren't they? How significant is Kenilworth and the siege there to their cause?
Well, Kenilworth is like this epic sort of siege. It goes on for at least 8 or 9 months. I think it's the longest siege in England to date. It's an enormous castle, obviously, and it was contemporary chroniclers describe it as massive because Simon de Montfort had refortified it. It's this huge stronghold, and it's one of the rebel headquarters after Simon is killed. And Henry brings the whole of the royal army to lay siege to it. And it is very sort of spectacular. The chronicle accounts of the siege are quite, dramatic. There's accounts of both sides lobbing stones at each other, and they collide and shatter in midair. And it goes on for months and months. Um, and yeah, it's all like fascinating reading, and you can imagine, it's quite cinematic. But at the same time, I keep coming back to Henry III and his policies. You do think, what are you doing? Why are you besieging this castle in the heart of your own kingdom? Um, there's sort of this political management is not great here. And these men who are defending Kenilworth, they're doing a lot of damage because they're not just bottled up in the castle. They manage to send out lots of sort of raiding parties, and they cause all sorts of devastation in the adjacent counties in Warwickshire, Northamptonshire. They go all rove all over the place, and it's not a sort of neat siege. It's absolute chaos. And while reading the accounts, I mean, we know what happened in hindsight, but you do get the impression that people at the time must have thought, when is this ever going to end? This sort of relentless cycle of violence.
Yeah, because your book continues till 1274, which is into the reign
Mm,
of King Edward the First.
mm, yeah, I mean, this second civil war goes on technically for 2 years, and it's supposed to be ended in July 1267 when Henry manages to re-enter London, and the rebel leaders, who by this point are Gilbert de Clare and John Dyville, who I mentioned earlier, they submit to him. But the Civil War isn't ended just like that. The sort of you get repercussions that go on for years, and there's more waves of violence after 1267. And by the time you get to 1273, when Henry is dead, he dies in November 1272, Edward's away on crusade, it all starts to bubble up again. And I think you could argue that this is another, when you look at what's going on, it's like this is another civil war. It's all happening again. The barons are fighting each other again. And when Edward comes home, there's an attempt to assassinate him. And he and his followers have to sort of, act very quickly to settle this. Um, and my book stops in 1274 because there has to be a cut-off point. I have to stop somewhere. But you could argue that this really keeps bubbling away all the way through to Edward II, because the rebels he has to fight, and now you're into like the early 14th century, they are the sons and the grandsons of the men who Henry was fighting, and pretty much over the same issues.
It's fascinating the legacy of this, as you say. Yeah, well, that
Mm.
echoes through. Can you see it go even further beyond Edward the Second?
I
I mean,
think,
these because it was quite a small world in
yeah,
amongst the
yeah, you're talking
barons,
about
wasn't it?
quite. I mean, they're all. Somebody once worked out that every baron on the battlefield at Evesham, on either side, they were all related to each other within the third degree of cousinage. So they're all relatives. They all, this is quite, as you say, it's quite a sort of small world in that sense. Um, I think with when Edward II kills his cousin Thomas of Lancaster in what's it 1322, um, that's the end of it, really. This particular spate of civil war, um, because then you get Edward III, who is a very sort of successful king for a while, and what he does is he diverts his nobility outwards. They go and fight the French, go and fight the Scots. They fight all these spectacular battles in France. Um, and the kind of issues that have been bubbling away for about 60 years are kind of like, forgotten by that point. It all goes to hell again under Richard II, but I think that's everything to do with him and his sort of context. I don't think by that point anyone was really looking back at, Simon de Montfort.
But then
He,
with Edward's conquest of Wales, was he able to kind of show military victory there, which sort of kept?
yeah,
Um,
I think Edward the First. He never has to. Edward the First is one of, I think, just two post-conquest kings of England in the medieval era who never has to fight a civil war. I mean, there's kind of protests, but it never comes to that. And yeah, he diverts his barons towards Wales. There's a war with France, Scotland, obviously the Scottish wars, and he manages to keep a lid on things. But he doesn't make the problem go away, because how do you do that? You can't just kill everyone. Not even, Edward's perfectly willing to kill people, but not his own sort of baronage. You have to come to terms with them. Uh,
they never return lands or money to the
well,
disinherited.
um, sorry,
Do they return lands or
sorry.
anything back to the disinherited, or do they just remain disinherited?
No,
And
no, that there's this big settlement called the Dictum of Kenilworth, which is where Henry comes up with this compromise whereby he allows the disinherited to have their lands back, but on a sliding scale of redemption fees. So depending on your scale of your offence, how big a traitor you were, and your kind of like your wealth, how much you can afford, they're allowed to buy back their lands. So yeah, there's that.
so, if your
Um,
surname is de Montfort, you probably aren't getting much back.
no, the Montforts are pretty much, yeah, they're excluded from this. Simon Jr. Is one of the rebel leaders after Evesham, but he's basically kicked out of England. He's made to go away. Him and his brothers, they are told to go back to France, which is where they came from originally, and just don't come back. Edward says, none of you are allowed back to England again. You're not having your lands back here. The earldom of Leicester goes to, I think it's Edward's brother, Edmund. And then you get people like Robert the Ferrers, the Earl of Derby, who was one of the rebel leaders after Evesham. He was given a chance of redemption, but he blew it and decided to go back into rebellion anyway. And so he was beyond the pale as well. He wasn't allowed to redeem his lands, and he was completely disinherited. And his lands were given to the king's younger son, Edmund. But by and large, people who were a bit further down, they were allowed to buy their lands back. Um, but this is after, another civil war. So Henry's been forced into this compromise, and I would argue he doesn't really, I don't want to slam Henry too much. It sounds like I've got a beef against him or something, but I don't think he really wins the civil war. He realizes that he's got to compromise. He's got to conciliate these men because he can't defeat them. I mean, he loses London at one point. They take London from him. He's lost his capital, and he can only get it back through negotiation. And it's not a great look for any king, really.
No, I suppose, his sort of military victories outside of England are what have sort of salvaged his reputation in that regard.
Henry III.
Edward the First.
Oh, sorry, I was talking
Oh
about
right, oh
Henry.
right. Well,
Henry.
I'll scratch
Yeah.
that bit. Um, but Henry the Third, as his reign is over,
Hmm,
he dies in 72. Is that right?
hmm,
1272.
yeah.
How should we look at Henry the Third today?
Um, well, as you said, he reigned for a very long time. And I mean, David Carpenter, who's like the authority on Henry III, has written two of these, like two mighty tomes on Henry's reign, which he had to divide into two parts because it's so complicated. Um, and then there's another author, Darren Baker, who argues that Henry is an underrated great king. Um, I don't believe in great kings personally. I prefer not to use that sort of language. I think there are things to be said in favour of Henry, and one of which is that he survives and he dies in his bed in his 60s, which is an achievement for any medieval king. That's got to count for something. And he did have his kind of successes and his ups, mainly in the sort of the middle part of the reign. But personally, I don't think he survived due to his own efforts. He was rescued at Evesham by Edward and the Marchers, and he makes lots of bad decisions. He's his own worst enemy a lot of the time. He fails to control his nobility, which is one of the main things a medieval king has got to do. And the last, depending on how you perceive this civil war, when does it actually start? I would say at least a decade, of violence and chaos. And I think the reason Henry survived, whatever might be said in his favour, is because the English hadn't yet figured out that you could actually depose and kill an incompetent king. Because prior to Henry, they hadn't actually done that, not even King John. And they finally do it with Edward II, because he's just completely hopeless. It's like, we can't have this guy. And it very nearly happens to Henry, and you can kind of see why. I mean, it's a very interesting period. There's lots of detail, but I don't think you can really frame Henry as some kind of underrated great king. I think it's a bit doing him too many favors.
Well, David, this has been fantastic. Thank you. So I'll put links in the show notes for
Great.
Rebellion against Henry III.
Thank you.
And I mean, it's just a fantastic story. It really is. And
it's a great story, whatever else it might be. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.